In this video, I would take 5 principal characters from the Woodlanders as a starting point for a detailed exploration of characterisation, themes and context, as well as exploring the named character in detail, with numerous relevant quotations displayed on screen for your own personal reference and further investigation. This video frequently shifts to providing detailed insight into the historical context, with Patricia Ingham's Authors in Context Thomas Hardy being a particularly useful source for this. In all his novels, Hardy is preoccupied by themes such as the role of marriage within society, the position of women, the nature of country life and class. These themes are also explored in depth at different points within the video. So stay tuned, this is an ultimate revision guide to Thomas Hardy's The Woodlanders. Within an uncertain, changing world in which remote rural communities are increasingly vulnerable, Giles Winterborne is a constant, stoical, highly principled and stubborn individual who seemingly dies to save the life of the woman he has always loved, Felice Fitzpiers. His name is first mentioned in Chapter 2, when a poorly John South tells his daughter that their property is lifehold like Giles Winterborne's. But when my life drops, 'twill be Mrs. Charmond's, not till then. The term lifehold refers to properties held on lease during the lifetime of a number of specified individuals, following which the property is returned to the landowner. In many cases, as happens in the Woodlanders, the landowner would choose to demolish the cottages and thus reduce future hassle and maintenance expenses. In Patricia Ingham's book on Thomas Hardy from the Oxford World Classics Authors in Context series, she stresses just how difficult life would have been for agricultural workers, like Winterborne, in Dorset during Hardy's lifetime. She reveals, Dorset, like the West Country, was a black spot in Hardy's time and had the lowest agricultural wages in England. These averaged 7 shillings and sixpence a week in 1850, which was 2 shillings and sixpence less than the cost of keeping a man in the workhouse, entry into which was after 1834 the main method of obtaining public welfare assistance. So before we even find out anything about Giles's character or life, it is clear to the reader just how vulnerable he potentially is. However gifted he may be as an agricultural labourer, and he is supremely gifted, the pay for such work is pitiful, and he could lose his home at any point should a 55-year-old man die. The life expectancy for men born in 1840 would be 40. As well as being in a vulnerable position, early indicators about Giles's character are overwhelmingly positive. He is utterly devoted to a woman from the same hamlet of Little Hintock. There is a certain dignity and self-possession about the way he conducts himself. And he is clearly able to empathise with others, particularly those from his social class. I referred earlier to Giles's talent as an agricultural craftsman, and this is something Hardy stresses time and time again throughout the novel. As well as great physical strength, which sadly and infuriatingly deserts him in the closing stages of the novel, Giles has a marvellous power of making trees grow. Although he would seem to shovel in the earth quite carelessly, there was a sort of sympathy between himself and the fir, oak or beech that he was operating on, so that the roots took hold of the soil in a few days. So there is clearly a natural affinity between Giles and his natural habitat, whereas the actions of other planters would result in 1/4 of the trees dying away the following August. His planting very quickly fosters healthy growth. In the Woodlanders, Hardy seems keen to place an appropriately high value on such natural affinities, and not just between human beings and the natural world, but also human beings and each other. Following her ill-advised, socially ambitious, and above all unhappy marriage to Fitzpiers, Grace meets Giles again in Chapter 33. The narrator reveals that Grace experienced acute regret at the sight of these woodcutting scenes because she had estranged herself from them. Hardy's use of language, in particular the verb estrange, is revealing. To estrange is to cause someone to no longer have a friendly relationship with another person or other people. Yet, in this context, it refers more widely to both the people cutting wood, including the man who loves her so faithfully, and the wider landscape. by prioritising illusory social gain ahead of maintaining a close bond with the people and environment of her home and community and that of generations prior to her, Grace has acted unnaturally. The price she has to pay for this is a lifetime dotted with dissatisfaction and regrets. And by showing Giles's dissatisfaction with her marriage and regularly indicating that she would have been happy with Giles, Hardy is subverting Victorian notions about the desirability of social advancement. The implication is that we may need to reassess what we value within our societies, with ordinary, decent, hard-working members of the lowly paid agricultural communities perhaps deserving a higher valuation within our blinkered hierarchies. Grace's failure to marry Giles contributes significantly to a sequence of events which ultimately lead to the latter's death. But there is no doubt that Giles himself could have tried a little harder and behaved differently during the period of time between her return to Little Hintock from boarding school and her subsequent marriage. For instance, although I have already suggested that Giles's self-restraint can be interpreted favourably as indicative of admirable dignity, you could argue that it also contributes directly to his failure to win Grace's hand in marriage. He continually fails to take advantage of any situation which might bring him closer to Grace, including allowing himself to be forgotten waiting outside her home after being given permission to pick her up following her return from boarding school, deciding not to interrupt an excited Grace as she prepares for the dubious honour of visiting flighty Mrs. Charmond for the first time, and most pertinently allowing Fitzpiers to step in front of him so he can be in the perfect position to catch Grace as she takes part in the old Midsummer Eve enchantment, which traditionally affords maidens a glimpse of their future partners for life. This resigned passivity is far more reminiscent of a Victorian woman's expected behaviour rather than a man's. Although Fitzpiers may hold the advantage over him in terms of education, novelty and family lineage, Winterborne's proud insistence on always being honourable, always self-effacing, makes it far too easy for his rival to win Grace's hand in marriage. As the original sanctioned suitor favoured by Grace's father, and having grown up with Grace during their formative years, many would argue that Giles would have to work hard to mess things up so as not to marry her. But this is what happens, and Hardy shows that it is the predators, i.e. Fitzpiers, not the natural nice guys, i.e. Marty and Giles, in both the natural and the human world, who are ultimately successful. Early on I talked about Giles's positive qualities, including his ability to empathise with those from the same class, evidenced by his sympathy for Marty's poverty. But actually, his ability to empathise is relatively narrow and affects his relationships with two women who care for him dearly. Firstly, he fails to appreciate that Marty South is hopelessly in love with him and thoughtlessly allows his female counterpart in nature to get dangerously cold during their joint winter tree planting in Chapter 8. Hardy reveals that his abstraction was such that he hardly was conscious of Marty's presence beside him, and the consequence of this is that Marty's outstretched hand was chill as a stone, and her cheeks blue, and her cold worse than ever. The reason Giles is so abstracted is that he is contemplating his great Christmas party, aimed at bringing Grace close to him. However, his inability to appreciate Marty's perspective, or even to notice her at all during their tree planting, in many ways brings him closer to his more selfish social superiors within the novel. Their motivations may be different. Fitzpiers will not countenance the thought of Giles being a love rival due to his social pride, whereas Giles himself just seems blithely oblivious to Marty's feelings. Yet the effect is the same, resulting in human beings being ignored and their feelings not considered. The narrowness of Giles's ability to empathise is also seen in his interactions with Grace. In Chapter 9, she tells Giles excitedly that Mrs. Charmond would like her to travel with her as a companion so that she can, hilariously self-indulgently, record her impressions of travel. Of course, Giles is not likely to be best pleased at this revelation, given that it would be even more difficult to negotiate an already problematic courtship with someone who is not present. However, his response is revealing. Hardy writes that his features stiffened a little at the news, and he asked briefly, "Indeed, what for? But I won't keep you standing there. Hoi, Roberts, Go on filling in there till I come back." Giles's body language once again highlights his own lack of artifice. He cannot hide his disappointed, defensive feelings, and this inability to mask, to conceal, puts him at a significant disadvantage when faced with a ruthless love rival who already has the advantage over him in terms of social position and mystique. His abrupt response, "Indeed, what for?" seems to be both an inquiry about what role Grace might take whilst travelling with Mrs. Charmond, but also an expression of surprise and astonishment that Grace might want to embark upon such an alien enterprise. Giles is so firmly entrenched in Little Hintock life and surroundings that he is incapable of thinking about or understanding life elsewhere. And this is a problem when it comes to wooing a young lady who has been educated and has travelled. It is not an insurmountable problem, as Melbury recognises, but Giles's inability to think beyond the bounds of Little Hintock does decrease the range of potential communication and connections between himself and the woman he loves. There is also a sense that Giles is regularly hampered in his quest for a happy union with Grace by his inability to communicate clearly. His poor strategic planning and communication about his Christmas party to the Melburys results in considerable embarrassment all around, and even worse, has the opposite effect to that originally intended. Rather than cementing his place as Grace's sanctioned suitor, Giles's farcical Christmas party is, inaccurately, cited by Melbury as the cause for Mrs. Charmond heading to the continent without following up on her suggestion that she might take Grace with her, and thus Grace is instructed, "Now, 'tis Winterborne's affair has done this. Oh yes, 'tis. So let me say one word. Promise me that you will not meet him again without my knowledge." Another failure of communication between Giles and Grace is seen in the aftermath of the latter's impulsive decision to edit Marty South's rather unkind graffiti. But Grace is wrong to assume that Giles would observe her, and instead, prompted by Marty, he believes that the change was made by some idle boy, thus resulting in another opportunity lost in terms of bringing the two together. The most tragic failure of communication, however, is seen in chapter 41, when Giles, entombed by his honourable notions of propriety and respect for a woman's honour, fails to tell Grace about the state of his health and the utter inadequacy of his shelter. Hearing of Grace's alarmed flight from the return of her philandering, all-powerful within the Victorian context husband, he gives up his ramshackle home, one chimney hut, and instead sleeps within a wretched little shelter of the roughest kind, formed of 4 hurdles thatched with brake fern. He is already ill, and dies soon after spending a night in this hovel, having to brave Lear-esque weather which hardly personifies to emphasise its appalling brutality. Grace is left to cradle a dying Giles in her arms and berate herself with cries of "How could I? How could I?" But this ending is arguably the inevitable climactic conclusion to a relationship repeatedly thwarted by failures to communicate clearly and in a timely fashion, and by over-reverence for social rules. Another contributing factor towards Giles's untimely demise include his failure to scrutinise the terms of his lease in time, which would have resulted in him avoiding losing his home, and his Henchard-esque stubbornness and hot temper. In chapter 13, Winterborne intercedes within a blocked route dispute between a heavy carriage laden with 5 tons of timber and the carriage of Mrs. Charmond, joined to a second carriage with luggage at my back. Winterborne deals with Mrs. Charmond's proud coachman sarcastically and insists on her smaller carriage backing up along the route to let the timber carriage through. Winterborne does win the battle, but he loses the war. Mrs. Charmond asks her coachman for the identity of that rude man and remembers this encounter when the very next day John South dies, resulting in the estate's reacquisition of his and Giles's properties. Writing via her lawyer, she sees no reason for disturbing the natural course of things, particularly as she contemplates pulling the houses down. Winterborne is furious and says vehemently to himself, "Then let her pull 'em down and be damned to her," only for his loyal underling Creedle to commiserate knowingly, "Ah, 'twas that spirit that lost 'em for ye, master." Another man would have recognised the importance of kowtowing to Mrs. Charmond during their carriage dispute, sacrificing principle and common sense in favour of feigned subservience. However, Winterborne is not able to act. He is not able to intelligently adapt to different circumstances and amend his behaviour accordingly. He is what he is, a stubborn man, disinterested in life and people that don't form part of the working rural community, that don't share his encyclopedic knowledge and instinctive bond with nature. But this lack of adaptability leaves him vulnerable to being usurped and overtaken by his more ruthless, manipulative counterparts. And what about the woman for whom Giles, Jesus-esque, effectively dies? What kind of character is she? Well, she is first described in chapter 5, when Hardy emphasises her cautious passivity, which would have been deemed so appropriate and womanly to men in particular during Victorian times. Hardy also gives a hint that such passivity might end up causing her more harm than good, which is shown later in the novel in her capitulations faced with her father's misguided but strongly expressed notions about the superiority of a marriage to a so-called social superior. Within the same section of the narrative, however, Hardy makes a more generic point relating to the inaccuracy of making assumptions about a woman based on her clothing. He writes, "For there can be hardly anything less connected with a woman's personality than drapery, which she has neither designed, manufactured, cut, sewed, not even seen. What people therefore saw of her in a cursory view was very little, in truth, mainly something that was not she." On one level, this seems a feminist argument, decrying society's cheap and demeaning custom of judging a woman largely on her appearance. However, when Hardy goes on to write that Grace appeared a shape in the gloom, whose true quality could only be approximated by putting together a movement now and a glance then, in that patient attention which nothing but watchful loving kindness ever troubles to give. He is not necessarily suggesting that Grace is an especially interesting character, she isn't, but also pointing out that those who watch and love acquire a deeper, more fulfilling, more accurate knowledge of a person. It is therefore unfortunate that Grace ends up marrying Fitzpiers, a sporadically well-meaning, but ultimately superficial, self-absorbed character who is not capable of troubling himself with any watchful loving kindness towards her. And of course, one reason Grace does end up marrying Fitzpiers is because her education has fostered in her an unsettling desire for more than what little Hintock has previously offered. Excitedly heading to Mrs. Charmond's house for the first time, Hardy notes that her sense of being properly appreciated on her own native soil charged her heart with expansive gratitude. She moved along, a vessel of emotion, going to empty itself on she knew not what. The implication here is not only that Grace feels her newly educated self is superior and worthy of greater respect than your average ordinary little Hintock country denizen, but also that she is dangerously susceptible and impressionable to someone from a higher social class who is prepared to, if only superficially, recognise this comparative superiority. Hardy writes that she is going to empty itself on she knew not what, which implies a dangerous preordained lack of discernment. The fact that someone of a higher class has acknowledged her is sufficient for her to decant emotional gratitude onto that person, irrespective of their worth and characteristics beyond their social status. So Grace is a dutiful, susceptible young woman who has been potentially temporarily fueled with ambitions to attain a more exciting, expansive life by her education, and her father's repeated references to this education. However, Hardy makes clear that Grace feels enormously pressurised by the expectations her father in particular now has of her. Following a brief, largely innocuous exchange with a gentleman foxhunter, Melbury oversensitively takes issue with the language used by the former when addressing his daughter, and concludes, "If it costs me my life, you shall marry well. Today has shown me that whatever a young woman's niceness, she stands for nothing alone. You shall marry well." The pressure Melbury is unwittingly putting on his daughter is enormous. He feels so strongly about Grace marrying well, with this adverb meaning within the Victorian context solely securing someone from a higher class, irrespective of their own personal characteristics or morality, that he is prepared to die to secure it. Grace herself struggles with her father's expectations. They trouble her, And even when Grace has married Fitzpiers, and it has been shown to be a horribly unsatisfactory partnership, Melbury still seems unable to grasp that his own misguided notions about the superiority of class are to blame in creating a lifetime of sporadic unhappiness and frustration for his daughter. In chapter 30, Grace articulates these feelings in a burst of emotions which amazed her father. She cries, "I wish you had never thought of educating me. I wish I worked in the woods like Marty South. I hate genteel life." Her tirade leaves her father much hurt at what he thought her ingratitude and intractability, and the reader is left to conclude that Grace may have ironically acquired knowledge of greater value from her personal experiences married to Fitzpiers in Little Hintock than she did during her years of fabulously expensive education. Whereas Melbury has held his prejudices about the desirability of social advancement for a lifetime and is so unable to fully reassess, Grace is younger and has experienced firsthand that marriage to someone with whom you have nothing in common, irrespective of that person's glittering lineage, cannot bring you personal fulfillment and happiness. It is tragic that this knowledge comes at a time and historical context when she is unable to do anything about it. She now knows that marrying purely for social advancement is foolish. But in a world in which the legal system discriminated aggressively against women, Grace Fitzpiers is trapped, with her father's super-pressurised behaviour, provoked by his ignorant prejudices, significantly to blame. I've already slammed Mr. Melbury's catastrophic, with the benefit of hindsight, decision to put so much pressure on his daughter to secure a socially advantageous marriage. But what is he like as a man? Why is he in such ingratiating awe of those from a higher class? So much so that he could even tell his daughter that she should ignore him on a public street once she has moved into the higher stratosphere facilitated by her education. Let's take the second question first. Melbury himself gives an insight into his feelings about the inferiority of his current position when he tackles his employee's gossiping curiosity about his plans for his daughter head-on in chapter 4. He relates an anecdote from his childhood at some length. "When I was a boy, another boy, the parson's son, along with a lot of others, asked me, 'Who dragged whom round the walls of what?' And I said, 'Sam Barrett, who dragged his wife in a chair round the tower corner when she went to be churched.' They laughed at me with such torrents of scorn that I went home ashamed and couldn't sleep for shame, and I cried that night till my pillow was wet, till at last I thought to myself there and then, 'They may laugh at me for my ignorance, but that was father's fault and none of my making, and I must bear it. But they shall never laugh at my children if I have any. I'll starve first.'" This anecdote is one which all of us can identify with from our childhoods. We are found out for not knowing something which others consider obvious. In this example, it was Achilles who dragged Hector around the walls of Troy. And the result is a generally temporary feeling of humiliation and foolishness, whilst other children mock and cackle. But in Melbury's case, the anecdote and the specific details of the anecdote have remained strongly in his consciousness for decades, even forming the basis of his future parenting policy. The impression gained from this narrative is that Melbury is a man of unusually strong pride and iron determination. He apportions disproportionate humiliation to a commonplace event from childhood and holds on to this memory for a lifetime in order to spare his child the same experience. This is clearly well-intentioned, but the modern reader in particular is left feeling uncomfortable. Should fathers place such savage emphasis on rewriting improved versions of their past on behalf of their daughters? And to what extent may this restrict and stifle? It is not just Melbury's paranoid imposing of an improved past on his daughter which is likely to unsettle the modern reader, but also his repeated use of transactional vocabulary when referring to her. This is seen in chapter 12, whilst insisting on Grace looking through his chequebook in a curious attempt to help sow in her heart cravings for social position. Following Grace's identification of the cost of her clothes, board and education as being as expensive as horses, wagons and corn, Melbury responds, "But if you do cost as much as they, never mind, you'll yield a better return." Grace quite rightly feels extremely uncomfortable with his transactional language and begs, "Don't think of me like that, a mere chattel." A chattel is defined as a personal possession, and it is clear that Grace feels demeaned by her father implicitly placing her on the same level as country goods such as horses, wagons and corn. Yet his response to this suggests that he doesn't really understand the point Grace is making, or even particularly want to understand. Whilst it is fit and right that a father should take pride in his child's accomplishments, in this case a broader range of vocabulary than his own, his cheerful complacent response also suggests that understanding his daughter's feelings and perspective is not something he can do. He could look her up and down to admire her feminine appearance, now topped up so gloriously by the magic powers of education. He can love her deeply in his Victorian father way, but this is his limit. And the fact Melbury unwittingly degrades Grace by referring to her as a commodity and fails to understand why she might not appreciate this should not be a surprise when we as modern readers consider the social and historical context. I've already referred to a brutally unfair two-tier divorce system which helped reinforce and propagate gender roles in which men's sowing of their seeds was to be accepted as regrettable but inevitable, whilst unmarried women should remain virginal at all costs. Hence Angel Clare's horror in Tess of the D'Urbervilles when, after relating his own sexual dalliance, Tess reveals the truth about her own sexual past with Alec d'Urberville. But Victorian Britain was not just hypocritical and oppressive to women in terms of sexual double standards, but in all areas. In terms of education, although opportunities did increase for women throughout the 19th century, including the founding of some fee-paying secondary schools, including Cheltenham Ladies' College for middle-class girls from 1850 onwards, and a few universities slowly making limited provision for women, it was not felt desirable or appropriate to educate the vast majority of women. As Patricia Ingham writes in Thomas Hardy, Authors in Context, the opportunities offered by these institutions and arrangements were still open only to a very small number of the relatively wealthy, although they formed a bridgehead in new territory. In terms of legal rights, women were non-persons in law who could not own property unless a trust had been specially created before the marriage, a resource available only to the very rich. The abiding orthodoxy of the period was that women were genuinely inferior to men, as stated explicitly by George Romanes, writing in Popular Science Monthly Volume 31 in 1887, the same year Hardy's The Woodlanders was published. Scientific observations include, lastly, with regard to judgment, I think there can be no real question that the female mind stands considerably below the male. It is much more apt to take superficial views of circumstances calling for decision, and also to be guided by less impartiality. And seeing that the average brain weight of women is about 5 ounces less than that of men, on merely anatomical grounds, we should be prepared to expect a marked inferiority of intellectual power in the former. Within this landscape of the majority accepting women's fragility and weakened intellectual capabilities, is there any wonder that Melbury occasionally unwittingly patronises his daughter and, until near the end of the novel, implicitly and explicitly places his own judgment above hers? By acting in this way, Melbury is merely behaving as millions of other fathers across the country and indeed the world would have behaved. He is just a product of his time. Whereas nowadays modern majesties such as the Daily Mail may bemoan the loss of a work ethic amongst a significant proportion of the working classes, there are no such issues in the mid-late 19th century world of the Woodlanders. And so Melbury is a product of his time, not just in his attitude towards parenting and his daughter, but also in his attitude to work. During his younger years he had worked hard, had wearied himself by prodigious muscular efforts, so much so that as an older man he can precisely identify the origin of various stiffness and cramps in different parts of his body. This may be a source of some frustration to him, but such pains also confirm his integral alignment to his local natural landscape. Like Giles Winterborne, like Marty South, Mr. Melbury is part of the very fabric of the place that is Little Hintock. His misguided assumptions about the superiority of Fitzpiers' name and social position is therefore demeaning not just to himself, but an entire landscape, community and history. To be fair to Melbury, he does excitedly try to obtain a divorce for Grace, following his son-in-law's wicked escape to the continent with that tigress temptress, Mrs. Charmond. However, this episode only serves to highlight his own naivety and ignorance. He relies far too heavily on the confident proclamations of a fallen into the mire drunk, albeit one who had once been a promising lawyer's clerk and local dandy. Even more pertinently, he continues his novel-wide habit of relying on his male judgment to instruct his daughter's behaviour, which only serves to increase her distress and unhappiness. Writing from London whilst investigating the exciting new divorce law, insufficiently summarised by the dandy as no more acts of parliament necessary, no longer one law for the rich and another for the poor, he informed her that she need have no further concern about Fitzpiers' return, that she would shortly be a free woman, and therefore if she should desire to wed her old lover, which he trusted was the case since it was his own deep wish, she would be in a position to do so. Melbury cannot help but direct and meddle. In this context, as is always the case, he is acting well intentionally. Grace is ill at home, and Dr. Jones has advised him that good news about the possibility of divorce may be the means of averting much harm. However, just a few days later, Melbury discovers that a divorce will not be possible, as he has not done you enough harm. In the meantime, Grace has shared a passionate kiss with Giles and given herself precious glimpses of a possible partnership in which she will be genuinely loved for herself and not just largely for her availability as a reasonably attractive, sanctioned sexual partner. In chapter 45, Fitzpiers notes that she had never looked so seductive as at this moment in the noontide bright but heatless sun and the keen winds and the purplish grey masses of brushwood around. Melbury has once again unwittingly caused his daughter a barrel load of emotional harm. By jumping hopefully to naive conclusions about a divorce and continuing to pressure her with his own deep wishes, he has helped create a daughter so worn down by life and her experiences that, after finding out that she will not be able to divorce, Fitzpiers declares, "I don't mind at all what comes to me." Melbury ends the novel a rather bewildered, bitter figure. Grace has finally realised that her life is likely to be happier if she doesn't follow his directives or continually consult him. She reconciles with Fitzpiers following their dramatic avoidance of death at the hands of Timothy Tang's man-trap. Melbury only finds out subsequently about their reconciliation after coming across them at the Earl of Wessex Hotel. Following her plea for him not to be angry, he responds, "I am not angry, though it is true I've been a little misled in this. However, good night. I must get home along." These are the words of an old man who implicitly recognises that he no longer has the power to expect his daughter to follow his instructions, both legally, as she is Fitzpiers' wife, and morally, as his past advice has had such disastrous consequences. His powerlessness is also reflected in his knowledge that Fitzpiers, the man whose social class and name he previously so revered, is likely to cheat on her again, yet there is nothing whatsoever he can do about it.
Through the presentation of the relationship between Fitzpiers and Grace, Hardy seems to be criticising a number of points about marriage. That it can be a vehicle for illusory social advancement, that it can be initiated partly to satisfy transitory sexual impulses, and that it can trap women in particular into a lifetime of degradation and subservience.
Edred Fitzpiers, as his name suggests, is an outsider in the world of the Woodlanders. He is viewed with dollops of suspicion by the locals. One woman refers to him distrustfully as very clever and learned, and in league with the devil. The latter rather outlandish claim is expanded upon in chapter 4, when Farmer Courtry, keeper of the local cider house, gossips that Fitzpiers wanted certain books on some mysterious black art, and in order that the people hereabout should not know anything about them, he ordered them direct from London and not from the Sheraton bookseller. The books were mistakenly delivered to the parson's house, causing the parson's wife to erupt into hysterics when she read them, thinking her husband had turned heathen, and 'twould be the ruin of her children. We need to be careful just how much we read into these comments and episodes. The community of Little Hintock is clearly very superstitious, as suggested by their participation in pagan customs, just as the old Midsummer Eve enchantment. They are also poorly educated creatures, moulded by history and the routines of agricultural life, which is likely to result in them viewing any type of difference suspiciously. The locals are not sure exactly what type of books Fitzpiers has been ordering, but given the parson's wife's concern that her husband had turned heathen, it seems likely that they could be interpreted as running contrary to the teachings of the established Anglican Church. Grace's observations in chapter 6 of brightly coloured lights coming from his window suggest one possible explanation, that Fitzpiers is conducting some alarming, potentially blasphemous chemical experiments. Hardy does not specify the exact time setting of his novel. It relates to a vaguely recent past with appropriate references to contemporary matters such as divorce law and types of tenancy. The references to the new divorce law in the text seems to point to an appropriate setting of the mid-19th century, when, of course, a self-declaimed independent thinker was likely to want to consider the ideas and theories behind text, including Darwin's 1859 The Origin of Species. Such texts argued against the quick-fire six-day theory of creation as expounded in the book of Genesis and the Bible, and instead stated that species evolved over an extended period of time or died out. Hardy presents the hamlet of Little Hintock in the Woodlanders as being almost timeless in its integral bond with the natural world, and cyclical work throughout the seasons. A world away from the new philosophies and discoveries taking place within less isolated communities. No wonder then that many of its inhabitants conclude that anyone appearing to engage with such alien new ideas and concepts, whether they are weird chemical experiments or blasphemous texts which contradict the teaching of the established church, must be in league with the devil. Melbury offers a fairer assessment of what kind of a man Fitzpiers may be when he suggests that he may only be a gentleman fond of science and philosophy and poetry, and in fact every kind of knowledge. This description is shown to be more accurate in chapter 6, when Grandma Oliver recounts a conversation with him to Grace. His interest in science, or at least anatomy, is shown in his offer to buy her brain post-death. Additionally, he projects self-indulgent and most convenient theories about the helplessness of human beings to self-regulate onto his no-nonsense listener. The overall impression is that Fitzpiers is a dreamy, wannabe deep thinker, whilst his morbid offer to buy Grandma Oliver's dead brain unwittingly gives a genuine insight into his attitude to the local Little Hintockians as a whole. They are interesting specimens to observe and briefly analyse, but not worth extended engagement on a living human level. Fitzpiers' sense of his own comparative, infinitely superior worth is seen when he yawns, "There's no society at all here. I should be quite mad if it were not for my books and my laboratory, and what not. Grandma, I was made for higher things." So Fitzpiers disdains the company of his neighbours, and arrogantly believes that he is preordained for much greater society and company. There is a sense that he feels such greatness ought to come to him without the need for much exertion or effort on his part. He was made for higher things from the hour of his birth, and he feels rather aggrieved that as yet this has not been fully appreciated by others. This arrogance, this sense of self-entitlement, is seen throughout his marriage to Grace. On the one hand, he is happy to accept and spend Melbury's money, and loftily ensconce himself within part of his home, irrespective to the inconvenience to his father-in-law. And on the other hand, he feels that his social and intellectual superiority means that he has the right to demand that there must be no mixing in with your people below. Fitzpiers' arrogant shamelessness is such that he even commandeers his wife's horse Darling, originally purchased by Giles Winterborne as a lover's gift for Grace, to transport him to and from the socially superior and sexually alluring Mrs. Charmond's house, with whom he soon embarks upon an affair. The hypocrisy and irony is breathtaking. Fitzpiers considers himself superior, yet is very happy to make use of a horse given to his wife by a man whom he implicitly disdains, to facilitate his self-entitled, dreamy philandering. Fitzpiers considers himself superior, but the modern reader is likely to disagree. He shamelessly lies to try to cover up his philandering, telling Grace that he was contemplating our old place of Oakbury in my ideal way, when actually dreamily fantasising about Mrs. Charmond staying at Middleton Abbey, and also claiming to have had an early morning tooth extraction meeting with Sue Damson, a voluptuous buxom country girl inexplicably devoted and attracted to him. Yet the narrator also suggests that perhaps we should not view Fitzpiers too harshly, and perhaps he is trapped by the repressive institution of marriage as much as his wife. In chapter 29, the narrator counters Grace's concern that he may just have married her for her little fortune. Yet here Grace made a mistake, for the love of men like Fitzpiers is unquestionably of such quality as to bear division and transference. He had indeed once declared, though not to her, that on one occasion he had noticed himself to be possessed by 5 distinct infatuations at the same time. He had loved her sincerely in his selfish way, and had by no means ceased to love her now. Just as it is in Giles' nature to love Grace solely and wholeheartedly, so Fitzpiers is instinctively attracted by and drawn to a number of women. His love may not be as noble and remotely sacrificial as Giles's, but this doesn't mean his love is any less real or existent. Hardy shows the folly of society's one-system-fits-all approach in relation to marriage. The likes of Giles are perfect for a single lifetime union, whereas the likes of Fitzpiers are not. Felice Charmond is a splendidly impulsive, dissatisfied with life creature who, like lover-boy Fitzpiers, is an outsider viewed with suspicion by the inhabitants of Little Hintock. Whereas Fitzpiers is initially castigated for his highly suspect reading matter and later his sexual improprieties, before being criticised for her actual sexual misdemeanours, Mrs. Charmond is disapproved of for her overly sexualised appearance. Reporting gossip from his brother-in-law, Creedle is clearly enjoying sounding scandalised as he reports that she would hypocritically sit down to her dinner with a frock hardly higher than her elbows. The claimed hypocrisy is seen in her ostentatious church attendance and loud recitations of congregational responses to prayers, yet eating her victuals with such a wanton figure as that. Hardy's descriptions of Mrs. Charmond regularly emphasise her sexuality. When Fitzpiers attends her in a professional capacity following her minor carriage incident, she is described thus. He saw a woman of full round figure reclining upon a couch in such a position as not to disturb a pile of magnificent hair on the crown of her head. A deep purple dressing gown formed an admirable foil to the peculiarly rich brown of her hair plaits. Her left arm, which was naked nearly up to the shoulder, was thrown upward, and between the fingers of her right hand she held a cigarette, while she idly breathed from her plump lips a thin stream of smoke towards the ceiling. The overall impression is of stage artifice. The hair has been artificially imported at some cost from Marty South, and the pose has been perfected in order to draw attention to her sexual femininity. Once again, with a nearly naked left arm, more flesh is displayed than would have been considered proper for the time, whilst the reclining position and upward floating cigarette smoke seems calculated to give the impression of sensuality and lackadaisical indolence. As well as being aware of the power of her sexuality, Mrs. Charmond frequently comes across as selfish and motivated almost exclusively by self-interest, as seen in her whimsical impulse to employ Grace as a companion to the continent, and her ruthless decision to pull down the recently expired life tenancy cottages following a minor spat with Giles. Yet Hardy also indicates that Mrs. Charmond is capable of kindness, albeit of a rather whimsical, impulsive nature rather than a permanent characteristic. She gives a recently shorn Marty South a lift home up a hill. She finds out about John South's illness and orders a doctor to attend him at her expense. And she vows to do something for that poor man Winterborne, however, after learning of her own involvement not just in him losing his home, but also the hand of Grace Melbury, which ironically impacts upon her due to the latter's marriage to the man with whom she shared such a romantic, cliched handkerchief encounter in her girlhood in Germany. However, these acts of kindness are rarely sustained, and on the whole Mrs. Charmond is too selfish and listless to do a great deal for others. The only exception to this is Fitzpiers, to whom she becomes hopelessly infatuated. Yes, she appears theatrical in her enjoyment of the drama and intrigue of their approaching love affair, but there is no doubt that her devotion to Fitzpiers becomes very real, and like Grace, this puts her in a subservient position from which she will never really recover. Her proclamation in chapter 26 that women are always carried about like corks upon the waves of masculine desires may be intended for theatrical effect, but this simile does accurately portray the vulnerability of Victorian women, even the wealthy, once they have succumbed to masculine desire. Once satiated and no longer captivated by her sensual tableau, Fitzpiers abandons her, taking advantage of impotent Marty South's vengeful letter about the source of her lustrous locks to flee to the station, where she is shot by another mysterious past lover. The narrator's description of this event gives an insight into how Mrs. Charmond, by no means an innocent party herself, has no power whatsoever to continue to attract Fitzpiers.
This, of course, happens in relationships. One side no longer fancies the other, but the context and ending to the Woodlanders draws the modern reader to sympathise far more with Mrs. Charmond than we might otherwise do. Not only does she end up dead, and Fitzpiers respectably back inside Grace's bed, but we also know that had she lived, she would have suffered far more due to Victorian society's double standards in which women are ostracised for their sexual misdemeanours and men forgiven. This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production exploring Hardy's The Woodlanders. Many thanks for watching.